She was born illegitimate, in a small town that had no room for her, to a mother the world looked down on, and a father who never once publicly acknowledged she existed. She arrived in Buenos Aires at 15 years old, with nothing but a face that stopped people mid-sentence, and a hunger so fierce it frightened the men who tried to control it. Within a decade, she was the most powerful woman in South America. Within 2 decades, she was dead. And Argentina has never quite recovered from either fact. They called her Evita. The poor called her a saint. The rich called her a threat. The truth, as it always is with people who burn that bright, was far more complicated, far more human, and far more heartbreaking than either side was ever willing to admit. This is the story of Eva Perón.
Eva Maria Duarte was born on May 7, 1919, in the small pampas town of Los Toldos, Argentina, and the circumstances of her birth followed her like a shadow for the rest of her life. She was the 5th illegitimate child of Juan Duarte, a local landowner who already had a legitimate family in another town and visited his second family the way some men visit a place they enjoy but have no intention of staying. When Eva was 7 years old, her father died, and the cruelty of what happened next tells you everything you need to know about the world she was born into. Juan Duarte's legitimate family refused to let his illegitimate children attend the funeral as proper mourners. Eva's mother, Juana, dressed her children and took them anyway, standing at the edge of that funeral as uninvited guests at a grief that was partly theirs, watching the legitimate family receive condolences for a man who had belonged, in secret, to them too. Eva was 7 years old. She never forgot it. She grew up in Junin, a slightly larger town, still small, still provincial, still a place where a fatherless girl born outside of marriage carried that fact on her skin in ways that the respectable families around her made certain she never forgot. She was poor in the specific, grinding way that is not simply about money but about being made to understand, every single day, that you occupy a lower rung of the world than the people looking down at you. She watched her mother take in boarders to survive. She wore the same dress until it fell apart. She sat in classrooms with children whose parents whispered about hers. And somewhere inside all of that, something was forming, not bitterness exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but a particular kind of determination that only grows in people who have been told, repeatedly and clearly, that they do not belong. At 15, Eva made a decision that took more courage than most adults twice her age could have managed. She left. She had become obsessed with the theater, with radio, with the idea that a voice and a face and a will strong enough could take a person somewhere that birth and poverty could not reach. She arrived in Buenos Aires in 1935 with almost nothing, attaching herself to a tango singer named Agustin Magaldi, who may or may not have helped her make the journey south, the exact details disputed by biographers who have spent decades arguing about a girl who simply refused to stay where the world had put her. Buenos Aires in the 1930s was not kind to young women without connections or money. Eva found small radio roles, minor theater parts, the kind of work that paid barely enough and required the company of men who knew exactly how little power she had and were not above reminding her. She survived. She kept working. She kept pushing against every door that was supposed to stay closed to a girl like her. What kept her going, in those early years in a city that did not yet know her name, was something harder to name than ambition, though she had that too in extraordinary quantities. It was the memory of standing at the edge of her father's funeral, uninvited, in borrowed grief, watching the world organize itself around legitimacy and connection and inherited belonging, and deciding, quietly, privately, with the absolute certainty of a child who has understood something fundamental about injustice, that she was going to make the world know her name whether it wanted to or not. The night that changed everything came on January 22, 1944, at a charity event in Luna Park Stadium in Buenos Aires, organized to raise funds for the victims of a devastating earthquake that had killed thousands in the city of San Juan. Eva was there as a minor radio actress, still working her way up through the edges of Argentine public life, still a girl from Los Toldos pretending the city had always been hers. And across that crowded room, she was introduced to a widowed army colonel named Juan Domingo Peron, 50 years old, powerful, politically ambitious, and quietly, methodically building the kind of influence inside the Argentine military that would eventually become impossible to ignore. Something happened between them that night that neither of them fully explained afterward, but within days they were inseparable, and within months, Eva had moved into his apartment in a city that noticed and disapproved loudly and changed absolutely nothing by doing so. Peron was unlike any man Eva had encountered in her years navigating Buenos Aires. He was not interested in keeping her small. He did not see a girl from the provinces to be managed and eventually discarded. He saw, with the instinct of a genuinely shrewd political operator, that Eva's story, her hunger, her voice, the way ordinary people responded to her, was something he could neither manufacture nor afford to ignore. And Eva, for her part, saw in Peron something that went beyond calculation, a man who spoke about the poor, the workers, the people Argentina's elite had spent generations ignoring, and meant it in a way that connected directly to every memory she carried from Los Toldos and Junin and the borrowed grief at her father's funeral. Together they built something that Argentine politics had never quite seen before. Peron rose through the military government, becoming increasingly powerful, increasingly beloved by the working-class unions he cultivated, increasingly feared by the conservative establishment that watched his popularity grow with the specific dread of people who understand, instinctively, that their comfortable arrangement with the world is about to be disturbed. And standing beside him, speaking at rallies, broadcasting on radio in a voice that reached into the poorest neighborhoods of every Argentine city, was Eva. She was not a politician's wife in any traditional sense. She was a force entirely her own, translating Peron's political vision into something personal, something felt, something that made the descamisados, the shirtless ones, the working poor of Argentina, feel for the first time that someone in power was speaking directly to them rather than past them. In October 1945, the military government moved against Peron, arresting him and sending him to an island prison. What happened next became the founding myth of Peronism. Eva went to the unions. She made calls, she pleaded, she organized, and on October 17, 1945, hundreds of thousands of workers poured into the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires demanding Peron's release. The government, faced with the reality of that crowd, backed down. Peron was released. He appeared on the balcony that night to a city transformed, and beside him was Eva, a girl from Los Toldos who had arrived in this city with nothing, and who now understood, in the deepest part of herself, exactly what she and the people in that square were capable of together. Eva Perón died on July 26, 1952, at 8:25 in the evening, and the radio announcer who broke the news to Argentina could not finish his sentence. He stopped mid-word, overcome, and the silence that followed lasted several seconds before anyone in the studio found the composure to continue. She was 33 years old. The cervical cancer that had been quietly destroying her body for 2 years while she refused to stop working, refused to slow down, refused to let the people who depended on her see how much pain she was carrying, had finally taken everything it came for. In the streets of Buenos Aires, people sat down where they were standing and wept. Queues to pay respects at her lying in state stretched for miles and lasted for days. 16 people were crushed to death in the crowds. The grief was not performed. It was the grief of people who had genuinely believed, somewhere beneath reason, that she was not the kind of person the ordinary rules of mortality applied to. In the years she had spent as First Lady of Argentina, Eva had done things that no one in her position had done before and very few have matched since. Through her Eva Perón Foundation, funded partly by donations and partly by considerably less voluntary contributions from businesses and unions that understood the political consequences of being seen to refuse, she built hospitals, schools, homes for single mothers, elderly care facilities, and children's homes across the country at a speed that the formal government bureaucracy could never have managed. She gave away sewing machines, shoes, cooking pots, medicines, and bicycles in quantities that her political enemies called corrupt and her supporters called justice, and the difference between those two descriptions depended entirely on which side of Argentina's vast inequality you happened to be standing on. She secured women's suffrage in Argentina in 1947, a fight she led with the same combination of absolute conviction and political ruthlessness that characterized everything she did, and watched as Argentine women voted for the first time in 1951, many of them in Eva Perón Foundation polling booths, a detail her critics noted and her supporters considered entirely appropriate. She attempted to be nominated as vice president that same year and was stopped by a military establishment that had tolerated her power for years but drew a line at making it constitutionally official, a humiliation she accepted publicly and almost certainly never forgave privately. What happened to her body after her death became one of the strangest stories in the entire history of political iconography. Her corpse was embalmed with extraordinary care by a Spanish doctor named Pedro Era, who spent over a year on the process, and was then stolen by the military government that overthrew Peron in 1955, hidden in a series of locations across Argentina and eventually buried under a false name in a Milan cemetery for 16 years, as if those in power genuinely believed that making her body disappear would make the idea of her disappear with it. It did not. It never does with people who meant what she meant to the people who loved her. Today her tomb in the Recoleta Cemetery in Buenos Aires is one of the most visited graves in the world, covered in flowers left by people who were not yet born when she died, still talking to a woman who spent her entire life insisting that the poor of Argentina deserved someone in power who remembered where they came from.